Hello everyone, today we are going to paint this simple meadow mountain scene, and I promise it's easier than it might look. I am using my Baohong watercolor 100% cotton paper. I love this paper. I'm also using a wash brush. This is just a Master's Touch wash brush and a Princeton round long size 8 brush. I'm also using my Daler Rowny watercolor paints, sticking mostly with yellows and greens and cerulean for the sky. I start with clean water over probably 2/3 of my paper, and I just really make sure the paper is saturated with pure water. Then I pick up some cerulean for my bright blue sky, mix it on my palette with some blue I already have. I just wanted a very clear blue color. And then I start dropping that in on my wet paper, leaving some areas of white for clouds. Because of atmospheric perspective, as I get closer to the horizon, it's going to be lighter in color. So I just tap the color off on my rag and use more of a damp brush to move the color around to get a lighter value down towards the horizon. I also picked up some purple from my palette that I had used the other day and added that to the sky just to have a little bit more color differentiation so that it doesn't look very flat. You can also add darker areas of your blue, and again, I'm using cerulean, so it just helps a very basic thing like the sky not just be one flat color with very basic shapes. We can add some texture and some change of color to really make it come alive. I just continue to tap my brush onto my rag, move that paint around, and maintain those white spaces to have some kind of a cloudy look. And also with atmospheric perspective, the top of your painting is going to be the darkest because it is what is technically closest to you from your vantage point. And so I picked up some more cerulean, added some Payne's gray just to get a darkness of color that almost feels stormy. And I added that to the top, and I also added that around the painting, focusing under the clouds and some areas on the sides to get a nice tie into the top. Try not to overwork your sky. It always looks better when it's dry, and here is the dry version. I love it. Now I've got a light yellow ochre mixture, and I'm going to use the side of my brush to create these mountain ranges. I'm also picking up other darker colors on my palette, greens and browns and Payne's grays, to blend together so that we can get highlights and shadows and differentiation in our mountain range. The reason I'm using my wash brush instead of a round brush is I'm able to get these really nice organic peaks and paint the mountain kind of coming down from the side at an angle, and it looks really organic. I also don't want harsh lines toward the bottom of the mountains, and so I am rinsing my brush, kind of scrubbing at those harsh lines that are starting to create so we can have soft edges, and then tapping that with my rag to really make it nice and soft. It will all make sense later. I just want to avoid harsh lines altogether. And then I'm moving pretty quickly while everything is still wet because I want the mountains to blend together. So I'm going to work on the other mountains, again using the yellow ochre mixture, the browns, the greens, the Payne's gray. I want them to blend together and then avoid the harsh lines at the bottom. And again, while it's still wet, I'm going to add in some more shadow colors to the right side of the mountain, because as I was painting, it feels like the yellow ochre really created a beautiful highlight, especially to the left. So now we have an idea of where our light is coming from. So the light is coming from the left. We want to focus the shadows on our peaks on the right side and maintain that golden ochre color as a highlight, because if we lose that, we lose the highlight, and it's really hard to bring back with watercolor. The main reason I want to have soft lines along the bottom of the mountains and not super harsh lines is because we are going to be putting trees here, and we're kind of creating a little bit of atmosphere, like a misty atmosphere, and so it will all make sense later. Now the rest of the painting is a meadow. There's not a whole lot going on, so we need to use color and texture to create this story. And so I'm using a really bright light green to represent highlights, maybe where the sun is hitting this meadow. And as we come farther down, I'm going to switch up the greens to create more shadows and depth and texture. So I've got a really bright light green, then I've got some darker sap green, then I'm going in with some yellow ochre mixed into that same green, and I'm playing around with the movements of my brush. I'm still using my wash brush to get some texture and movement to the grass, creating hills, creating valleys, little dips, and maintaining some white space so that it feels like this isn't just one solid brick of grass. We have movement within our meadow. So that can be tricky when we're just using paint and we're not really painting a bush, but we are using the texture of our brush to create bushes, to create different feelings within the landscape. So I like to start using indigo in my greens to really get a sense of depth, shadow, texture within this meadow. And then you can jump back into your lighter greens to have more of the highlight, to have more of the typical grass. And then, if you work fast enough and your painting is still wet, you can tap in some of the color back up into the painting. So you'll see that after I do create the shadows down in the front, which is down at the bottom of the painting, you can go back and add some of this darker shadowy color to the rest of your painting where there might be some shadows because there is a bush there. Using your paint, using your brush to create areas of white space, and using the paint as the shadow and the highlight, you can create a lot of texture and paint a really beautiful story, even though it's just a flat meadow. We need to get most of that texture and feeling in the meadow in one go so that it blends really nicely. So at this point, we're going to let it dry before we go back and add more details. Now we are going to paint those trees that I kind of left space for. And it's going to tie in why we needed all of this room under the mountains. I was lucky that some of my landscape hadn't dried yet, and so the trees blended into the grass really nicely, and it was just a nice, smooth, even blend. So that might not happen with you. It just depends on how fast you're working. I tend to skip around really quickly. Maybe that's a ADHD superpower. I start with my light, bright green, making circular motions with my round brush. So now I'm moving to my round brush because we're going into the details. I like using my wash brush for as much as I can because I feel like it makes my strokes really organic and natural without me thinking too much about it. And then when I need to scrub in the details like trees, I really can't use my wash brush anymore. So we're using the light yellow greens for the highlighted areas, and then I'm taking indigo and mixing that into the green to tap in our dark shadowy areas. Now, again, our shadows are on the right side because our light is coming from the left, and if you do it quickly enough, you get a nice even blend from shadow to light area. It seems really dark right now, but the shadows we're creating at this point are actually our middle values. So you've heard me say it before, we need our light values, middle values, and dark values for the painting to really look finished. I like to make sure that the darker values are also not just in the bush themselves, but on the ground, creating the shadow on the ground. And it also helps anchor the bushes to the horizon instead of looking like they're floating and there's no differentiation between the bush and the grass. So I like to make sure that I have some kind of dark lines along that horizon. Now I am taking a bluish, greenish color. I'm not being too picky about the colors I'm picking up. I just don't want black. Don't pick up black. You can do some brown, some green. Mountains are all different kinds of colors. And I am using my brush on the side, kind of swiping it so that I'm getting a lot of texture. And then if I create too much texture, you just pick up some water and smooth it out. We are maintaining the highlights on the left side of our peaks while trying to bump up those middle values and darker tones on the right side so that we can start building up those layers until we get to our even darkest values towards the end. Now you can see that some of those shadow areas that we placed on the bushes earlier have actually lightened quite a bit and become more of a middle value. So we are going to just continue to add more green indigo colors to our shadowy areas as we bump up that contrast. Now, I really prefer to add indigo to greens to create that dark shadowy color. I would just suggest don't use black. Use whatever shadowy type color you want. Indigo mixed with green works really well for me. And I like at this point when I'm placing it and it's my darkest value, I like adding a little bit more detail. So not just total scrubbing in of the color, but also using the tip to create little bits of branches and leaves and texture. The most important thing you can do is maintain your highlight. And if you feel like there's not a huge difference between your highlights and your darker values, you can increase your darker values so that your highlights stand out a little bit more. Now we are going to focus on the details on the foreground, which is the area of the painting that is closest to us and the lowest on the painting. So I wanted to create a kind of feeling like we are in shadow and we're standing in this grassy field, but the shadows are all around us because the highlight is way over there. It's in the grassy meadow, it's on the trees, but there is a shadow, maybe a cloud or a tree near us. So I'm creating lots of texture in that really dark indigo color and some darker values of sap green, and just kind of bringing a very textural, solid bush on the left side. And then I wanted to play with texture and values on the right by not quite painting it a solid color, but doing some dark areas of detail. So I just did a couple of strokes, and then I played with some strokes of detail as I'm coming up into the more highlighted areas. If you do too many detailed strokes, it can look really piecey. So if you do get to that point where it started to look like there's just too much going on, you can tap it with your rag, you can scrub it out with your damp brush. You want to add details without it feeling like it's too much, but any type of contrast where you're adding a darker value is really going to make the other values pop. We don't want to erase our light and middle values. We just want everything to look like it was supposed to be on purpose. So adding dark values really makes it feel like, okay, wow, this is grass. I see a little bit of texture. My eye fills in the rest, and it makes sense. Moving on back to our mountain peaks, we have our light values, we have our middle values. We are just going to finish it off with our darker values, maintaining the highlight on the left and increasing the contrast on the right side with those darker values. Just keeping it light, keeping it loose. Mountains can be kind of hard. Look at a reference picture and see where there would be texture and divots and how the light catches mountain ranges. I'm not necessarily perfect at it, but I feel like the looser you do it, the more your brain fills it in. If you try to go too detailed, it almost looks worse unless you're like perfection at detailed paintings, which I am not. So I try to keep it loose and more abstract so that your brain can fill in what I'm trying to accomplish. Often, when I get to the end of a painting, I sit back and think what it needs, and usually the answer is birds. I think it's because they add so much life and movement to a painting that can seem really stiff. And you know that something's living there. Life is going on, and I wish I was there, standing in this meadow, watching the birds fly. I try to stay away from doing V shapes only like I used to do, and add a little bit more of a body and maybe fuller wings so that they look more like real birds. But the farther away they are, you can't add as many details, so you can do more of a tiny little V up or down as their wings are flapping. And that is our painting. Thank you so much for being here today while we painted this mountain meadow scene. I really enjoyed this one, and I hope it was more simple than it might have seemed at the beginning, and that you learned a lot of valuable techniques for your landscapes. Let me know if you try this painting out, and I will see you all next time. Bye.